Hello, good evening, everybody. My name is Bob Abbey. I'm an adult services librarian for the city of Forest Grove. Welcome to everyone who's watching tonight on the library's YouTube channel and also on our Facebook page. Very pleased to have our special guest tonight, Elizabeth McLagan, who is the author of A Peculiar Paradise, A History of Blacks in Oregon, 1788 to 1940. This is the last of three programs that we've had this month to mark Black History Month. And this evening's program is also quite special because this edition, the second edition of A Peculiar Paradise, was just reissued in 2022 by Oregon State Press. The original was published in 1980. And this is really, even to this day, one of the most important contributions to Oregon history and an incredibly significant contribution to the history of the African American experience in Oregon. So we're very pleased to have Elizabeth with us this evening. I want to, before we get started, I want to first of all thank our co-presenters and co-sponsors for this program, the Student Multicultural Center at Pacific University, for their very generous financial support for this program and for so many of the programs that we do throughout the year. They are great partners and they help us bring these programs to you. I mentioned that I work in Forest Grove, but I am coming to you this evening from Hillsborough. Both of those venues are located on the colonized lands of the Atfalati Kalapuyans, who are also known as the Tualatin Band of Kalapuyans, who were the first inhabitants of Washington County. Today, their descendants are members of the Grand Ronde and Siletz tribes, and they uphold the traditions and cultures of their ancestors. I hope you'll join me in acknowledging and expressing gratitude for the ancestors of this place and recognizing that we are here today because of the sacrifices that were forced upon them. As part of honoring that legacy, their lives, and their continuation in our communities, I encourage you to spend time and learn more about the rich history of Indigenous peoples locally, regionally, and nationally. Our guest tonight, Elizabeth McLagan, is a freelance writer and retired instructor at Portland Community College. In addition to A Peculiar Paradise, Elizabeth's works have been published in journals such as the Bitter Oleander, Bellingham Review, Beloit Poetry Journal, Poetry Northwest, and Willow Springs, among others. She's written Notes Toward a Biography, The Papers of John Hiram Jackson, which was published in 1988 by Portland Community College, and contributed an historical overview of women and minorities for the Oregon Regional Disparity Study, as well as a chapter entitled A Very Prejudiced State, Discrimination in Oregon from 1900 to 1940 for the anthology Seeing Color, Indigenous Peoples and Racialized Ethnic Minorities in Oregon, which was published by University Press of America in 2007. So I'm going to bring Elizabeth into the stream. Good evening, Elizabeth. Welcome to our program.
Thank you.
We're very happy to have you with us tonight. And the format tonight is we're going to be doing a little different setup. Elizabeth is going to be talking, and then we'll have some space in between for some comments and questions. As always, please feel free to post comments and questions in the chat box during the program. It's not an interruption. It doesn't bother any of us, and we can get to those later on. So, Elizabeth, I will hand the microphone over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Bob. And I would just like to say that I just looked on the program, some of the programs that Bob Abbey has hosted on for the Forest Grove Library. And there are some really wonderful programs, and I urge you to check them out. And I'm glad this is going to be available also, not just tonight, but in the future for other people who can't make it. Maybe you're snowed in, or maybe you're trying to get home tonight. It's very wintry here in Portland, but of course I'm snug in my basement study. I'd like to also begin by offering a land acknowledgement. The Portland metro area rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their home along the Columbia River. Indigenous people have created communities and summer encampments to harvest and enjoy the plentiful natural resources of the area. They have stewarded this land since time immemorial and still live and thrive here. I would like to begin with a short history of the 2 editions of Peculiar Paradise. The first edition, this started out as a job. I was hired by the Oregon Black History Project to continue the work previously done by a Centennial Commission, largely consisting of oral histories and photographs. We worked for a year compiling more oral histories and conducting research in libraries and archives, mostly here in Portland, as I recall. After that year was over and the funding went out, compelled by the voices I heard, I kept on working to create the narrative that resulted in this book. 42 years ago, there was no internet, no search engines or digitized resources, no computers, no spell check. Hard to believe. There were also only a few books in print about Oregon's history, and none, as I recall, in print about the experience of Black people in this state. In my research, I found that the history of Portland's African American community was and is rich and detailed. But the history of people outside the Portland area was brief and anecdotal too often, as people of color lived throughout the state in ones and twos and threes, and their lives were more difficult to unearth and time-consuming to document. So these were some of the research challenges we faced in 1980. And again, I wanted to reiterate the fact that the book ends at a crucial point in the history of African Americans in Oregon at the beginning of World War II, when things changed and many people came to work in the shipyards. So this is all before that period of time. Obviously, this book is written by a person who has to acknowledge the white legacy of legal and social discrimination. I'm almost positive that there were slave owners in my past. So one of my ancestors was a governor of Georgia. I don't have any details, but if you were a wealthy person, you enslaved people because that was part of your wealth. That was part of what you did. It's like people have Mercedes and yachts, so on, and fancy mansions today. Well, in those days, rich people enslaved people. So I carry that. And I can only say that I tried very hard to disappear inside the words and the photographs so that the people and the stories could clearly speak for themselves. I am grateful for the opportunity I was given, and I will always be grateful for that time 42 years ago. After the book was published, my life took a different direction. I had an opportunity to get an advanced degree at PSU to continue studying Black history, but I chose not to. And I think it's partly because I wanted to leave the door open for someone else, someone of color whose research could lead to things that historians crave, a good paying job and a career in history. So I stepped aside at that point and went on to other things. This new edition came as a complete surprise. Out of the blue, about a year ago now, last January, I think it was, I was contacted by Tom Booth of OSU Press, explaining about the partnership between the press and Oregon Black Pioneers to digitize the book and produce a new edition. And I was thrilled. OSU Press, had always been the press that I would want to republish this book if it were ever possible. And from time to time, people would contact me and say, this book is really important. Why is it out of print? Why can't I get a copy of it? Or the copies were really expensive and so on. And I would say, well, I don't have the copyright. In fact, I didn't know really who for sure had the copyright. It was a nonprofit. So it had always been in the back of my mind that it would be great to reissue this or to produce a new edition, but I had no control over it. Oregon Black Pioneers, and specifically Zachary Stocks, the executive director, acquired the copyright. They acquired it from Benton County Historical Society, who had acquired it from Georgian Press after the death of Kimbark McCall. So he worked tirelessly with a team of volunteers to update the work with this smashing new cover. I love this cover. If you spend some time with this cover and you see so many wonderful details about George Fletcher, and then you can read about his life too. So they had to spend a lot of time, a lot of work they had to digitize the book. And then they had to work with a table of contents to create one that matched the new pagination. So it was really a lot of work. And I am happy to report that they are the sole beneficiary of book sales. So, when you buy this book, you're supporting Oregon Black Pioneers, and I'm going to say some more about them later. It's not often that a book gets a second chance, but long out of print, it has remained a foundational resource for historians, activists, and frankly, Black people trying to figure out how to thrive and negotiate the legacy of racism in this oh-so-white place. I would like to recommend a book to you. This book is called Survival Math. It's written by Mitchell Jackson, who grew up in Portland. And to anyone who wants to understand what it was like to grow up African American in Portland, he was born in the 70s. And when I got this book and started reading it, I was really struck by the preface, because it is in part a thumbnail sketch of the experience of Black Oregonians. It's addressed to Marcus Lopez, the first Black person to visit and swiftly die on the Oregon coast in 1788. The preface begins, "Dear Marcus, ain't no way you could know this, but you were the first of us to set foot on the land that became the state where I was born, Oregon. And now here we are, strangers, but not estranged, more like kindred, more like forevermore tethered to terra firma by a death date and birth date. Yours, August 16th, 1788. Mine, August 16th, 1975. Here I am, centuries after your death, wanting to share with you what has become of the place where you gasped your last breath and I gloried my first." Jackson's prologue continues to narrate the history of the Black experience here, coupled with his own memoir of growing up and surviving in this place. He concludes his prologue wondering if it is possible to thrive here as a Black person. Quote, I asked myself, could this new place, home, which seemed so much the locus of our undoing, be the harvest of our collective deeds? The answer is yes. But the answer is also that you, he's still addressing Marcus Lopez, and me, and the generations between and beyond us must refuse assuming the greatest weight for what this place has become. Because if these centuries attest to anything, it's to the incontrovertible truth that this isn't our Eden and won't be, for that was never their intent. Only a knowledge of Oregon history could allow him to make that statement and have it ring true. I will never forget at the book launch last November, a woman asking me to sign her copy of the first edition. I have never seen a book in worse shape. All the pages were out, and this, my copy is pretty bad, but hers was much worse. She paid over $100 to acquire this necessary work, this story of her people in this place. It was a tattered treasure. This new edition costs $22.95 and will remain in print. And I'm kind of happy to say that the prices for the first edition have really dropped dramatically. It's not $100. If you wanted to buy a first edition, it's much cheaper than that.
Elizabeth, this is a good opportunity. We will mention Third Eye throughout the evening, but I want to share a link to their website, and Elizabeth will talk later this evening about why this particular company in Portland, why this particular store is significant. But if you wish to purchase this book, and I hope you do, please visit their website and purchase from them. It's interesting. We were talking before we went live about my introduction to this book was as a librarian at the Oregon Historical Society back in the mid-90s, and our copy of A Peculiar Paradise had been bound and rebound and rebound so many times, and it was still falling apart. And at one point, we actually had to take it out of circulation because it had been bound so many times that we couldn't bind it anymore. We had to get another copy, and it was very difficult to find one. I think it took us over a year to find a replacement because at that point the book was out of print, and so we juggled with this conundrum about providing access to a book that really was so important, but was very fragile, and not being able to get a replacement copy. So your story about the woman who approached you at the book signing rings true in a different way. I also want to just mention that Mitchell Jackson contributed a chapter for the book 400 Souls. He has a chapter on Oregon, and it's a wonderful kind of addition to the preface that you mentioned. So I would encourage folks to read that as well.
I'm going to write that down. I was not aware of that. I actually met him at a writers' conference Napa Valley. I wasn't in his class. He teaches fiction. I was taking a poetry class, but and I didn't have his book at the time. I always wanted to ask him, did you get a chance to read Peculiar Paradise? Because his preface follows so closely what's in the book that I thought perhaps that he had read it, but he may have had access, to Xerox copies or something else. But I thought it was so striking.
Mm-hmm.
And that preface is so beautifully written. I just gave you a little sample of it, but it's written in his own brilliant vernacular style, and much more appealing to young people, I think, than the history that's in the historical style that I used.
Well, the chapter in 400 Souls also is written in that same style, and he talks about the expulsion and exclusion laws, and at the very end of his chapter, and they're not very long; they're 5 or 6 pages long. He talks about an incident at a Salt and Straw in Northeast Portland, and how there had been a shooting, and how white folks have been using the ice cream place as kind of an Instagram photo opportunity, even though there had been some shooting or active violence in the background. And it's a very interesting kind of dissonance that's happening there. But great writer and wonderful, wonderful voice for Portland.
Yes.
So again, if you have questions or comments, please post those. Otherwise, Elizabeth, I'll let you continue, and then I'll pop back up.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, speaking of the exclusion laws, that is what I want to talk about next. This book has 2 overarching themes, and both begin in history but continue into the present. And first is a long, many-chapter discussion of the legal and social barriers facing people of color. This was the easier of the 2 themes to document. Hidden in plain sight were the territorial documents establishing the exclusion laws, the proceedings of the state constitutional convention, which included drafts of the Exclusion Clause, plus the frank admission of those who had come to Oregon with their enslaved people, seeking protection of their property. Openly admitted, here is the die-hard pro-slavery faction that helped write Oregon's laws. This and much more constitute the long history of legal and social discrimination faced by Oregon's African Americans. The Exclusion Clause in the Constitution of the state of Oregon in 1859, that was when it was ratified by the vote of the people, was and remains Oregon's signature decision. No other state entered the Union with an exclusion clause in its constitution. It was not accomplished by executive order, but by the vote of the people, at that time propertied white men. 3 items were on the ballot. Should the Constitution be adopted? 7,195 yes to 3,215 no. Should slavery be allowed? 2,645 yes to 7,727 no. And the third question, which read, do you vote for free Negroes in Oregon? 1,081 yes to a whopping 8,640 no. One might ask, how did this happen? Is this a relic of pre-Civil War attitudes, or is it something deeper and more long-lasting? The wording of the question was provocative, and tempers were high in 1859 nationwide following the Dred Scott decision of 1857, probably the worst decision ever made by the Supreme Court of the United States, when they ruled that Black people, quote, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. But the fact is, the Exclusion Clause lingered in the state constitution for 67 years until it was finally repealed in 1926 after a 33-year-long campaign by Black Oregonians to petition for its removal. Clearly, the sentiments that produced the vote in 1859 lingered on and on, at least in the minds and attitudes of the state legislators. But what difference did it make, one might argue, since the Civil War federal amendments superseded the state constitution and extended citizenship, legal protections, and voting rights, initially for men only, to Oregon's Black people. But if we think about the long civil rights struggle, it is that local law is often far more powerful than federal law. You know, local is local, and Washington, D.C. is often a long ways away, especially here in Oregon. Black Oregonians knew this. That is why, with their extremely busy lives, they petitioned and petitioned and petitioned again at the state legislators for the clause's removal. And I just want to reemphasize the fact that I tried to find it in the book, but one of my sources was Otto Rutherford. And he said that, you know, the jobs that Black people held, they weren't just a 9 to 5, 5 days a week. They often held 2 and 3 jobs. And a lot of the leaders of the community worked on the railroad. So they were gone a lot. And when they were home, they had other jobs. So for those people to take time out of their busy lives and put on their church clothes and go to Salem every time the legislature was in session to petition for these clauses removal, that was a big deal. You know, that's a serious effort on their part. And finally, in 1926, it was accomplished. But I'd also, back to the subject of why does Oregon have an exclusion clause in its constitution? I mean, we probably will never fully answer the question, but here's another idea. I'd like to consider another opinion, which was offered in support of the exclusion of Black people from Oregon. It comes from the pen of Peter Burnett, who wrote letters published in Midwestern papers praising the potential of the Willamette Valley and urging white people to move west. He said, "The object is to keep clear of this most troublesome class of population. We are in a new world under most favorable circumstances, and we wish to avoid most of the great evils that have so much afflicted the United States and other countries." In other words, blame the victim. And this victim blaming is nothing new. We have seen it not just directed at people of color, but other people, including women. But someone steps out of line, someone asserts their liberty to move freely through a landscape, a neighborhood. Well, if something goes wrong, it's their fault. And I have this little exercise in empathy. This is something to think about, especially if you were like me, a white person. A woman is out at night with friends or alone, and maybe drinking in a bar by herself, perfectly legal. She's just exercising her liberty. And maybe she's wearing a short skirt because it's hot. If she suffers a sexual assault, however, it has been argued that her behavior caused the crime. If the woman decides to press charges, it's her reputation that's often on trial. And I ask you, how would you feel if this woman was your daughter or your sister or your wife? If this woman were you? Victim blaming. Or let's just say your relative is sick, and in a panic, you exceed the speed limit as you race to the drugstore, only to be pulled over and very possibly treated with violence or worse because you are DWB, driving while Black. Blaming the victim, it's insidious. We are still living with the consequences of the decisions made by our settler colonial fathers. It's something we should remember. It's something we should never forget.
You mentioned Peter Burnett, and we could talk a long time about Peter Burnett, who was has a very checkered history, not only in Oregon but also in California, where he was governor as well. And he became the first elected governor of California in 1849. We've experienced in recent years I think an important shift in our perspective about people like Peter Burnett, people who for many years were held up as exemplars of the drive to move west and to establish Oregon as an Eden. And we now know that the Eden they were looking for was a white Eden, an exclusive Eden. Can you talk a little bit about how you have noticed that shift taking place? What have you seen in terms of the way we think about someone like Peter Burnett now, as opposed to when you published the book in 1980?
Well, one of the comments I think when in 1980 was, well, he was just one person, and he wasn't so bad after all. He just said this one thing. And to me, we elected in 2016 another Peter Burnett. I mean, somebody, you can see the impact that his statements had on people, and how people all of a sudden thought it was legitimate to have these points of view. And of course, we're still hearing about, we're still in that era, and we're a divided country because of it. But on the other hand, I guess this doesn't relate so much to Peter Burnett, but it's the way that having somebody say something like that opens your eyes to the truth that has been buried. That these opinions are sort of legitimized now. And I think we might say, oh yes, there's a lot of progress that has been made, and I think that that's unarguable, but there's still a lot that has not changed. And I think the kind of lie that that the people who are the victims are to be blamed, that goes back to the founding of our country, and it's, when you sort of rip the bandage off, when you rip the fake news off, the lies that we've all been told, and you realize, this is still going on. It's nothing new, but it's time to face it, and it's time to, and I think that's happening. I think that's one reason why this book has been published again. So maybe that's a long answer to the question. That's, I guess, how I see it.
Mm-hmm. Well, there definitely was a different attitude in 1980, right? I mean, that
Yeah.
was the idea that people like Peter Burnett and Matthew Deedy and all of the figures who have been immortalized in Oregon history had any past at all, other than the sort of pristine history that was passed on was in 1980. I mean, it was 42 years ago. It was not that long ago. I mean, in
No.
the long arc of history, that was not a long time ago. But that shift in perspective has been so significant in even a fraction of that time, right? And as you point out, that kind of opening of the eyes of things that were hidden in plain sight. They've been there all the time, right?
Yeah.
They're in the documents. This is not something
Yeah.
that someone's making up. It's right there.
Yeah.
It's interesting too when you talk about the urge to blame the victim. I think about the writer Albert Memmi has a term he calls the mark of the plural. And it's a way that he uses to describe the tendency to deny individuality to a particular group of colonized individuals. And we see this, for instance, if a person of color is arrested, that act becomes representative of an entire group, whereas if a white person is arrested, it doesn't. And then the kind of second act of that transaction is to blame the victim, right? It becomes, and we've seen it recently with police shootings. Well, if he'd only obeyed, right, and that becomes the narrative. So that tendency is there, and it's been there all along, right?
But I think if you can understand that this is something that happens to women, you know, that becomes something anybody can relate to that. And then you can apply that across the board to other people whose unfortunate, things unfortunately happen to them too. It's not always as it appears, it's not always the knee-jerk reaction. In fact, it usually isn't. So yeah.
Before I disappear again, I just want to let folks know that I have put a link to a resource list in the chat. This includes books and also some web resources. These books are available through Washington County Libraries, and the web links are for articles in the Oregon Historical Society's Oregon Encyclopedia, a link to the Oregon Black Pioneers website, and also to the Oregon Remembrance Project. And some of you who have been following our programs over the past couple of years will remember when Taylor Stewart appeared last year as part of Black History Month and delivered just an amazing talk about the link between lynching and capital punishment and mass incarceration. So those links are on the resource list for WCCLS. And I should say one of the books on that list is Greg Noakes's book about Peter Burnett. So if you want to read more about him, that's an excellent book as well. So Elizabeth, I'm going to back out again. Oh, I'm sorry.
OSU Press.
Yes, OSU Press, right. I'll back out again and I'll be back in a few minutes.
All right, great. In case I forget, I really want to, this book, it is really an important book to read if you really want to understand what it's like to grow up in Oregon and as a Black person. She lives in Portland, and of course this applies nationwide, but a lot of her examples, and they're universal examples, but it's a really great book to read. I was introduced to this by the Charles Hannah and Michelle, I forgot her last name, at Third Eye Books. And they said, reading this, you understand why this book is so necessary. A Peculiar Paradise is so necessary, because if people don't know their history, they can't build resilient lives. They don't understand what goes on in this state. They can't build resilient lives. Okay, so the other overarching theme of the book was more positive, and it's amazing to me, considering all the barriers. And of course, the exclusion law is just part of it. There's a lot of barriers about housing and jobs and public accommodations and the right to marry who you want. And I just touched on one aspect of that, but those are other discriminatory laws that are also discussed in the book. But the other overarching theme is I call the and yet, which is also still ongoing. And yet, people of color came, settled, owned businesses, thrived, lived lives of dignity and beauty and worth and pride in this oh-so-white state. And I was just reading a little section from the history of the Portland African American community. And around the turn of the century, people would say, I was really lonely. There were no Black people here. I went down to the railroad station just to see a Black face. So part of the reason that there were so few Black people here is that it wasn't a very welcoming place. So part of this legacy is a legacy of missed opportunity. And I think this is this idea of the missed opportunity and how white people have been not benefited, but have suffered because, not as much, but have suffered because of discrimination against Black people. You know, in the South, Black people couldn't swim in public pools. What did they do? They cemented up the public pools, so nobody could swim in the public pools. That's just a small example of this. But back to Oregon and this idea of missed opportunity. We do not know how many people of color chose other destinations because of Oregon's racist laws. We don't know what lives they might have lived here, how they might have contributed to our communities. We don't know them, but we can imagine them, and we should miss their presence. But we do know the story of George Washington Bush. And I'm going to read, this is an excerpt from chapter 1. Oh, not that page. Among those arriving in Oregon Territory in 1844 was a Black man named George Bush and his family. Unlike most of the other Black people who claimed to Oregon, Bush was a man of wealth and even aided other needy families on the trip west. The date and place of his birth are disputed, but according to the family history, he was born in Pennsylvania in 1779. His father, Matthew Bush, was born in India and was brought to the United States as a servant of a Captain Stevenson. His mother was Irish and was a maid in the Stevenson household. According to one observer, his descendants show no trace of his Black heritage, and there are no pictures of him. While his ethnic heritage may be disputed, he was racially identified as a Black person by his contemporaries. John Minto recalled a conversation with Bush while on the Oregon Trail in 1844. I struck the road again in advance of my friends near Soda Springs. There was in sight, however, G.W. Bush, at whose camp I had received the hospitality of the Missouri Rendezvous. Joining him, we went on to the springs. Bush was a mulatto, but had means and also a white woman for a wife and a family of 5 children. Not many men of color left a slave state so well-to-do and so generally respected, but it was not in the nature of things that he should be permitted to forget his color. As we went along together, he riding a mule and I on foot, he led the conversation to this subject. He told me that he should watch, when we got to Oregon, what usage was awarded to people of color, and if he could not have a free man's rights, he would seek the protection of the Mexican government in California or New Mexico, which probably wouldn't have been a good idea considering what happened there. He said there were few in that train he would say as much to as he had just said to me. I told him I understood. Ezra Meeker, another friend of Bush, said that he had left Missouri because of the virulent prejudice against his race in the community where he lived. Bush had lived in Tennessee, Illinois, and Missouri for over 20 years. He had also been employed by the Hudson's Bay Company and may have visited. In 1832, he married Isabella James, and they raised a family of five boys, five of whom survived beyond infancy. Bush left Missouri as a middle-aged man of wealth. Stories were told of the false bottom in one of his wagons that concealed over $22,000 in silver coin. The crossing to Oregon was full of the usual problems of scarce food and water, and heavy rains delayed the party so that they arrived at the Dalles late in the fall of 1844. Bush spent the winter on the south side of the Columbia River near the Dalles, tending the livestock. Michael Simmons, his friend and partner, spent the next spring and summer exploring the Puget Sound area. In October 1845, the two men and their families left the Dalles and settled on good farmland near modern Tumwater, Washington. Oregon had declared its prejudice against Black people by passing the first of the Exclusion Laws in 1844, but the law could not be enforced in the wilderness north of the Columbia River. Bush enjoyed a free man's rights in that unsettled country, in an area still called Bush Prairie, and helped to secure American claim to modern Washington state. The first years were hard, complicated by severe winters, but the Bush family prospered, raising wheat and vegetables. Isabella raised poultry and sheep, and seeds of fruit trees brought from Missouri soon began to bear fruit. The family's reputation for kindness and generosity were well known. One year, wheat was in short supply, and Bush was offered an unheard of price for his entire crop. His response was not forgotten. "I'll just keep my grain to let my neighbors who have failures have enough to live on and for seeding their fields in the spring. They have no money to pay your fancy prices, and I don't intend to see them want for anything in my power to provide them with." And wow, what a good neighbor he was. Washington was organized as a separate territory in 1853. Under the provision of the No Nation Land Act, Bush could not legally claim title to the 640 acres of land he had settled and farmed since 1845 because he was a Black man. His white friends did not forget him, and the first Legislative Assembly passed a petition on his behalf, urging that Congress pass a special act giving George Bush title to his land. The following year, this was approved. And I'd like to follow this with the story of another Black Oregonian, Leticia Carson. She's actually mentioned in Peculiar Paradise in a single sentence, the garbled version of her name, Leticia Censor. Subsequent scholarship, and been 42 years of scholarship, subsequent scholarship has unearthed her story, and now it forms the centerpiece of one of Oregon Black Pioneers' projects. Here is the story as we know it now. And this narrative is taken from an exhibit put together by Oregon Black Pioneers. Leticia Carson came to Oregon in 1845 with David Carson, a white man. Their relationship and Leticia's status as a free or enslaved person is unclear. She and David had two children together, Martha, born during their trip to Oregon, and Adam, born in Benton County in 1849. David filed a 640-acre land claim, the amount of land allowed for married couples. In 1846, officials reduced Carson's claim to 320 acres as they did not recognize Leticia and David's marriage. In 1852, David Carson died without a will. The executor of the estate, Greenberry Smith, sold the Carsons' land on Soap Creek in Benton County and the livestock. Leticia believed that she and her children were entitled to the property as David's survivors, but the executor disputed her claim by emphasizing that she could not legally be married to David. As an added insult, Leticia was forced to pay Smith $100 for the recovery of some of her own necessities, including her bed. Incidentally, that $100 is worth over $3,800 in today's money. So it was a sizable sum. Black people were forbidden from bringing suit against whites under the Oregon Constitution, but as a resident of Oregon before the law's passage, Leticia was exempt. In 1854, she sued Smith in Benton County Court, claiming that if she was not David's legal wife, then she must have been his employee and was therefore due back wages for her 7 years of service. In May of 1855, an all-white jury agreed and determined that she was due $530, or about $18,000 in today's money, for her services as David's employee. After that victory, Carson sued Smith again, this time for the value of the property sold. Again, the court agreed, and she was awarded $1,600, in today's money over $83,500, for the unlawful sale of her cattle and property and for her court fees. Leticia and her children moved to Douglas County, where they lived with the Hardy family in Upper Cow Creek Valley. In May 1862, President Lincoln signed the Homestead Act into law. Unlike the Donation Land Act, the Homestead Act did not exclude claims from Black people. Leticia Carson filed a claim for 160 acres in Douglas County in 1863. It was approved in 1869, making Carson the only Black woman in Oregon to successfully secure a land claim under the Homestead Act. The ranch she built included a 2-story house, barn, smokehouse, cattle, pigs, and an orchard of over 100 fruit trees. She died in 1888 and was buried at Stevens Cemetery in nearby Myrtle Creek. One of the ongoing projects of Oregon Black pioneers, in partnership with Oregon State University, the Black Oregon Land Trust, and the Lynn Benton NAACP, is the creation of the Leticia Carson Legacy Trust. This group is working to transform Leticia Carson's Soap Creek homestead into a 21st century site where future generations of Black and Indigenous growers, gatherers, foragers, entrepreneurs, and leaders can gather and connect with Black history at the site where Leticia once lived. Here all can experience the power of place and stand shoulder to shoulder with the ancestors. An archaeological survey on the land is the first of many ongoing projects, and you can actually become involved by making a contribution to Oregon Black Pioneers. So this is just a small sampling of the contents of Peculiar Paradise. And I'm happy to say that in the intervening years, more books have come into print. The second edition has a list of resources, many of which are available from Third Eye Books, a 100% Black-owned business in Southeast Portland. And it's really my pleasure to think about this book being in conversation with these other books that have come out. And so the story just keeps getting richer and richer.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I did post a link to Third Eye earlier in the chat, and I will post it again. And just a reminder that the reading and resource list that I mentioned just a few minutes ago includes many of the books that appear in the reading list of the second edition of Peculiar Paradise. And it's interesting that you talk about how this book is now in conversation with these later additions to the history of Oregon, and there are a number of scholars who are contributing valuable work on a variety of aspects of Oregon's history related to this. And I would urge everyone who is interested in continuing that conversation to seek those publications out. Some of them are monographs. Many of them are published in scholarly journals. The Oregon Historical Quarterly publishes a number of them, and in fact often devotes entire issues to topics related to African Americans, Asian Americans, populations that have been marginalized and excluded from the traditional history of the state. So please check those out. And there are also organizations, Oregon Black Pioneers being one of them, who are involved on a daily basis in reclaiming that history and turning a light on an aspect of the history of the state that, again, has always been there. It's just been invisible. Elizabeth, you mentioned in the preface to the original edition, and I just happened to glance down about the stopping point and the period after 1940. You said a second volume covering the period after 1940 is necessary. What would you think that second volume would cover? What would it talk about?
Well, so many things happened, and you know, the very last chapter of the book is just kind of alludes to things that happened in the 1940s. The shipyards brought many people to Oregon, you know, and then there was the Vanport flood, and there was a real housing crisis after that flood, and then so many things. One book that I think this is University of Washington Press, but here's another book that is fairly recent about the Portland Black Panthers. And so, you know, there are some people that are publishing little bits, and I mean, this isn't a little bit, but publishing pieces of that. But, you know, and I don't know if you could do it in one volume. Well, you certainly could, but it's, you know, it's very time consuming. I mean, we had a year to do the research, and I think about that. It's not very long. And then I think I wrote the narrative over a summer. I think it was a summer. Maybe it wasn't longer than that, and that seems really fast in retrospect. So it might not just be one book. It might be, it probably will be many. I mean, you know, I'm not sure that, I mean, there's so many more opportunities now. People are really hungry to read about the history of African Americans and Native Americans and Asian Americans. And I think, you know, if I look, I am a friend of, well, I follow Third Eye Books, and they talk about how people just come in and they're eager to read the material that are the books that are available. And so there's a lot more opportunity than there was certainly 40 years ago for people to get published. I mean, publishers are eager to meet this demand. So there might be a number of books that come out that cover the after 1940. It would be a much bigger project. In a way, the project was easy because relatively easy because it was a shorter time period, and there weren't as many people to talk about, or groups to talk about.
You talked early on about the genesis of this project and how you never really imagined that you'd be revisiting it. And can you talk a little bit about what your life was like after this book came out and leading up to 42 years later. What else were you doing? What other things were you working on?
Well, I had a child, for one thing, and so he was a big part of what I spent my time doing. I became a teacher, although I struggled to find a job because I wanted to work part-time. I wrote a children's book, which never went anywhere. Well, I had an agent for a year, but it was never published. I've written poetry for a long time. And I think especially, things kind of simmered along, but there's just been this explosion of things to read about, in the last, since 2016, I would say. That was a real watershed, I think, for me. And I really became hungry to read American history, and not only just Oregon history, but American history, and and Native American history, to really get the lies, get away from the standard history and the lies that it told. So, and then I also, reflect on my own life and my own feelings about where Peculiar Paradise fits in. And I think for a long time I thought, okay, this is Black history. This is history of African Americans. And I didn't really own it the way I would own it now, not in terms of the culture, and not in terms, certainly, of the direct experience that people have, because I've been exempt from that, but to own it as part of my history too.
Mhm.
And since you mentioned that I am a poet, I'd like to read, if you don't mind, a couple of poems that kind of really go along with that. And then, my family, I grew up in Corvallis, and it's again, it's a very white town. It was then. And I never had any, there was a couple of twin students at Corvallis High School, but I didn't know them. But I would say that my parents weren't particularly racist, but they also didn't know how to teach anti-racism. And I don't know that anybody did. We were white people living in a white town, and there were no opportunities to challenge my awareness of that. So I feel like I had a typical small town Oregon upbringing. And but there were several incidents that happened, and one of the incidents I talk about in this poem, which I would like to read. It's called "The Pursuit of Happiness." This world is white no longer, and it will never be white again. James Baldwin. It was a family gathering. My mother's family, aunts in the kitchen with my grandmother, uncles and cousins in the living room. Because it was Christmas, my grandfather was there too, a man I hardly knew, by reputation a binge drinker, wife beater, kicked out of the family by his children, but allowed by my grandmother to sit in a small corner off the kitchen. I might have been 10 years old. The uncles had a way of speaking, a way of moving their hands. One worked in a shop, another in the woods, a third on the railroad. I felt no shame in the way they earned their living. It was honest work. There had been a drunken accusation of mother-son sex by the man in the kitchen corner. I was not held on a man's lap. If the uncles drank, they did it elsewhere. There was joking, conversation, some snackings, Brazil nuts in the mix. Then someone called them and toes. A pause, and then laughter. A noose of whiteness closing around us. For a moment, I suppose, we felt better about ourselves. We could say these things in the privacy of our homes. It was all so easy. I thought about how it would feel to eat someone's toes. The nuts had a skin that fired the roof of my mouth. My tongue itched so hard, it was done with speaking. And the second poem is a little more recent, or about another recent experience. It came out in a really nice journal that's no longer publishing, but Windfall. And it's called The Day After Watching If Beale Street Could Talk. I remember that movie was so important to me in my learning process of what it's like to grow up as a Black person in the United States. The day after watching If Beale Street Could Talk. I am climbing an old street toward an ancient volcano, breathing hard because of the extra weight I am carrying, so that some summer day I might still walk out among the big volcanoes, Hood, St. Helens, Rainier, sweat out some miles, less each year, but still to enter a wilderness, to pitch the tent I carry, to eat the food I've packed, to bed down among the alpine firs. But today I remember the sad and endless burden of my race, white, like those who have inflicted pain and misery on our darker citizens. And I want to reach out and say, sister, brother, when maybe what is preferred would be my simple indifference. I'm doing just fine, thanks. I could say, I am not to blame, but I have by accident of birth what I don't deserve. Still, I am here. I remember, step forward, step aside, stop talking, listen. That is the constant that. But I'd forget myself and wonder if I am alone in this, wishing to ignore the troubled world for an hour or so and walk through an afternoon of rain and reflection. Trees in standing water, branches in puddles, power lines crisscrossing, the sky a pale wash, gathering us all inside.
Thank you for sharing those. I share your insights about If Beale Street Could Talk. It's a wonderful movie, and if those folks watching tonight have not seen it, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's a really beautiful movie and a very powerful movie. One thing that stood out in that last poem, you invite people to stop talking and to listen. And I'm wondering, as we move forward in this journey of discovery about the history of African Americans in Oregon, in addition to stopping talking and listening, what else would you suggest we do? What other mindsets do we bring into this study to become better neighbors, better friends, better citizens of this state? How do we embrace this history?
Read. Books have always, been a way of entering the experience of others that I would never be able to enter. I mean, there's a whole wonderful world of books that can be read, that should be read. I remember reading Charles Charles Blow's memoir, Fire Shut Up in My Bones, and then they made an opera out of it. And that's just one example, but there are so many books that we can read. And I'm not a terribly social person. I read and I reflect. But yeah, I think that if people are in book clubs and they can read. And I also think that it's important not to say, okay, this isn't my history, right? I think it's important to say this is our history. This is a collective history. What did Martin Luther King said? If we all came, we may have all come over on different ships, but we're in the same boat now. And so we live in this place all together. This is our home. This is everybody's home. And I feel like that was kind of a failure on my part not to embrace Black history as part of my history. And there are good reasons for that, because I'm not culturally part of that community and I haven't suffered like that. But on the other hand, I think it is important to in some sense draw lines around the whole community rather than dividing ourselves up into different groups. So that's kind of more of a mindset than anything else. So those are the things that I do. They're easy. Books are just fascinating to me. And I love reading. And I read in poetry and nonfiction and fiction, all of those genres. And, there's great books in all of those genres.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to extend the invitation again to anyone watching. If you have questions or comments, please post those in the chat section, and we can definitely get to those. I guess the one question I would ask is, what are you doing now?
I'm retired.
You're retired.
So this is really has nothing to do with, it does have something to do with history, but not specifically Black history, although I'd like to bring it in. My husband, a year ago, I just had a birthday, and a year ago, he bought me a GoPro. And so we hike a lot, and we have this little tiny YouTube channel called Two on a Trail. And we always do a land acknowledgement, and we always do something about the geology or the history of an area, or some plants, usually not animals, because you don't really see too many animals on trails, but birds. And so that takes up a lot of my time. And I write the music. It's piano, ukulele, and whistle. And I write the music that goes with the videos. So that's one thing I do.
That's great. Actually, I've come across your channel back when I was arranging before I contacted OSU Press. I was being a librarian, I'm very curious, and I ran across a couple of your videos, and there was one in I forget where it was, but they were out in Eastern Oregon, and that's such a beautiful part of the state, and
yes.
It was great. You're just we're following you on the trail, and you're making comments, and it's like we're on the hike with you. It's great.
We also volunteer for the Oregon Natural Desert Association, and that's been really fun. We go to parts of Eastern Oregon, and it's not a monolithic part of the state. I always thought it was, but it's not. It's not like going from Bend to Burns. There's so many beautiful places there, and we planted trees and done restoration work, mostly riparian restoration work. with the Oregon Natural Desert Association, which is a great organization. And I travel a lot. My family, I'm a 5th generation Oregonian, but it's the last generation. My son absconded to France, married a French woman. I have 2 French grandchildren, so I travel. I have to go see them. That's what I'm doing.
That's great. That's great. Well, Elizabeth, I want to thank you for taking time out this evening on this cold and I guess snowy February evening. One of the great benefits of doing virtual programming is everybody can be safe and watch online. For those of you who know of somebody who might be interested in watching, these videos are archived on our YouTube channel. They stay there in perpetuity, so we'll be there forever. Please let your friends and family know about these, and if you want to revisit any of these videos at any time, they're there on our YouTube channel. So we encourage you to revisit them. And Elizabeth McLagan, thank you so much for joining us and for providing a much needed follow-up to an important part of the conversation of Black history in Oregon and the history of everyone in Oregon, as you rightly point out. This is all of our history. Buy this book, folks. Third Eye Books. Put the link in the chat.
Yes. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Be safe out there. Be well. And until next time, we will see you later. All right. Good night, everybody.